What up with you folk, man? I pray that y'all continue to be healthy and well out here, yo. One of the things that I thought about earlier is what is considered traditional. You know what I'm saying? And being that there's many religions and other traditions that people have been doing for generations, in their family. My question is it working? You know what I'm saying? In a healthy way, because I spoke with quite a few people, and they grew up in a religious household, and they went to church and everything, and because they were different, they were looked down upon, and or they didn't, or they were very rebellious. They didn't agree with the church, or with the Bible. You know what I'm saying? And keep in mind, these people are not bad people. They're genuine good people. You know what I'm saying? I done seen people get kicked out of church, or the religion because, they slept with each other before marriage. You know, I done seen people that that are quote unquote, church goers or religious, but yet they are so busy judging everybody. I literally had a heavy experience with that shit. It was it was back when I used to work in a hotel many years ago, yo. And me and a friend of mine was talking, and we were cursing, and he went up to me. He was like, "Yo, you're not a child of God because you cursed," and I looked at him and I'm like, "You got to be fucking kidding me! How much energy did it take for you to prance your happy ass on over here and engage into a personal conversation that you wasn't even fucking invited in?" You know what I'm saying? Last time I checked, the Bible said, thou shalt not judge. You know what I'm saying? And no, here's the fucked up, really weird part. Do you know how many fucking priests or pastors have been caught with sex trafficking and shit? Or cheated on their wives? Or they're sleeping with little boys or little girls? Right? But yet, you are so fucking busy judging me. I find that to be fucking hilarious. You know what I'm saying? And the guy had, walked away. You know, you he was, he was quite upset. I did not give a fuck. You know what I'm saying? So, with that in mind, for some of these traditional, people out there, or people that's in religions, they got married, and of course it says till death do us part. But when when those two people get married, one of them is extremely abusive, mentally or physically, possibly both. But because there's they came from a traditional background or religious background, they don't want to leave, because they may have a fear of being looked down upon. What I'm saying, I've met quite a few people that grew up in a religious home, and it wasn't for them, and this is one of the things that I spoke about outside influences of society is constantly projecting onto people. You know what I'm saying? So, and some of those people, checked out. They didn't want nothing to do with, with the religion, the church, or the family. Because instead of being in tune, with the child and asking themselves like, how come this child is different, or just come from a naturally curious, place, or raise their child or children off of empathy. Instead of doing that, they constantly force their beliefs, onto on their children, and so when it comes to traditions or religions and cultures, my thing is that shit really working? I actually, the better question is it healthy? You know what I'm saying? Some of these, people, that have traditions, they're out there that's with the whole sex trafficking and shit. They may consider that traditional or a culture because it's working for them. But we obviously know that shit ain't fucking healthy whatsoever. You know what I mean? So with the whole, when it comes to traditions, from the old days in regards to relationships with, the man being, the head of the house, or, he was a financial breadwinner and the woman was working at home. You know, since, slavery days, like speaking of that, some of those women were being abused inside that home, because what the fuck makes you think that if those slave masters were doing that, the worst possible shit to those slaves, what the hell makes you think that they're going home to their wives and not doing the same damn thing? You know what I'm saying? So it's just something that I think about. But now, we're in a world where women are making their own bread. You know what I'm saying? And on for that, from that, I think, that shit was purposely fucking designed. It was either, I can't remember, either the Rothschilds or Rockefellers. They purposely funded the women's liberation movement, and Aaron Russo spoke about this shit in his interview on YouTube. And they supported the women, supported those, the women, not because they actually gave a damn about the women. No, they didn't. They don't give a fuck. The whole entire point was to divide the families. Because they couldn't tax stay-at-home mothers in those times, and it was also to indoctrinate kids on how to think by, sending them to schools. You know what I'm saying? Now, don't get me wrong. You had, a few women who were crooked as fuck, um, and went along with it because they sold a whole. They was with the whole scheme. Now, was it a whole bunch of them? No, I don't think so. You know, but they pretty much tricked, the women into going to working. Instead of, for the women that's been abused, right? Didn't they just, this is just my thinking. If I had, having, if I had that much power, what I'm saying, and I end up finding out that though, multiple women are being abused in the home by their husbands or whatever, especially in those times. Excuse me. For one, their husband is going to be in jail or prison. You know what I'm saying? The land is going to, belong to, the women and their children if they have any children. And I was, sent to, therapy. Because obviously, when you go through abuse, you're mentally fucked up. Possibly physically too. And spiritually. You know what I'm saying? But did they do any of those things? Nope. They just sent them all to the workforce. So I think about, shit like that. Just because something is traditional or considered the norm, is it healthy and is it good for people? You know what I'm saying? How many of y'all have experienced, you know, something being traditional, being passed on from one generation to the next, and there's one and finally a black sheep, rose up and was like, yeah, nah, this is not it, because for some of those traditions, it's really about power, control, and manipulation. You know what I mean? So I, you know, I didn't, I started questioning all these things. You know what I mean? Because if I were, and this is just me, and I'm pretty sure any conscious person or someone that's clearly self-aware within themselves, if they see that a child or children are in a system and they are rebelling the system, you know what I mean. I would be asking myself, like, how come are they rebelling the system? What happened to them for them to rebel the system, or the traditions that have been passed along, to them, that's not working for them. You know what I mean? But because of certain parents out there, it's, you're gonna do what the hell I say, because you're a child. You're a child. You can't really defend yourself, like speaking of it, yo. You know what I mean? But and that's one of the reasons why those same children, when they got older, they checked out. As I said from before, they completely are done with their family. They're done with the church. They're done with their religion. You know what I mean? But they either I would just well I would like to know what's been y'all experience. You feel me? And what do you think is considered traditional to you? You know what I mean? Um, because in case some of y'all didn't notice, this system that we are living in, this shit is getting broken down because people are getting tired of it. Anyways, man, y'all take care till next time, man. Much love to y'all, man.